Welcome to Elevating Consciousness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guests today are Sylvie Barbier and Rufus Pollock, the co-founders of Life Itself, a collective of pragmatic utopians committed to practical action for a radically wiser, weller world. Sylvie is a French-Taiwanese ritual artist whose work synthesizes Eastern and Western philosophies and aesthetics. Her performance art pieces are contemporary rituals where the audience is invited to take an active and interactive role. Rufus is an entrepreneur, activist, author, and long-term Zen practitioner who has founded several successful for-profit and non-profit initiatives. His 2018 book, Open Revolution, is about making a radically freer and fairer information age and has been translated into multiple languages. Rufus and Sylvie's lives come together, both as a couple and through the work they are doing with Life Itself, which includes creating practice hubs in developmental spaces, driving research on the meta crisis and pathways towards a second renaissance, and building partnerships across disciplines by connecting thinkers, artists, communities, and organizations exploring post-conventional ways of life. In this conversation, we explore how Sylvie and Rufus' inner work paths converged and led them to co-found Life Itself. We discuss some of the challenges of running it, touch on the meta crisis and what the second renaissance movement is attempting to address, explore art's role in collective transformation, and so much more. Enjoy. Sylvie Barbier and Rufus Pollock, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Great to be here with you, Artem. Yeah, a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And I'd love to set some context before we begin. I've been aware of Life Itself for some years now, and I definitely see you as significant players in the liminal web. And last year, I also had a chance to briefly meet you both at the Human Transformation in a Time of Meta Crisis conference at Harvard, which you hosted. And today I'm excited to dive deeper into the work you've been doing with Life Itself and the Second Renaissance movement. But before that, I'd love to know a little bit about how your journeys kind of intertwined. I'm always struck by, when I find couples who seem to be on a similar path and whose work overlaps. And that certainly seems to be the case with you two. And, you have unique backgrounds. My understanding is, Rufus, you come from an economics background. Sylvie, you're a performance artist. So I'm just really curious to also your inner work path. Were you already both kind of on your inner work path before you met? How did that, you coming together, kind of influence your own kind of journeys? And yeah, I'm just kind of curious about that meeting and coming together. Whoever wants to start can go. Yeah.
Well, I will get started then. I'd like to use a metaphor of there's one way you can be in love, which is like gazing in each other's eyes, and maybe you see a bit of your own reflection in their eyes, and that's a beautiful way of connecting. And also another way of sharing love is by looking at the same direction together. That you might not meet in each other's gaze, but you meet where your gaze look towards. Is that two lines that are parallel? They share a direction, and I feel that our relationship have these two components: moments where we are in love in seeing one another, and the reflection also where in a relationship you become each other's mirror, and at some point you're like, which part is me, which part is you? And then there's also that we share a vision, we share a direction, we share something we both want to give our life to. So that's maybe a part of our relational dynamic. And maybe Rufus can share a little bit about our intertwining path. Or I can also say more, but I think it's good to have both our voices.
Well, yeah, you should say as much as you feel. We met in a way quite by chance, but you said about inner work path. So I think that is true that on our first, I did not realize it was our date, but Sylvie did think it was a date. We got into a big debate, I think, about Buddhism, because I said I was a Buddhist or, Buddhist practitioner. And Sylvie, who's from half Taiwanese, was like, I don't know how to think, I don't know, you can say about like kind of white men into Buddhism kind of thing. And I think so certainly I'd been really interested. And I think the thing though I could say that really struck me from almost our first meeting was this discussion about wisdom. And there's this word, and it really struck me. Sylvie was talking about wisdom and living wisely. And that was like really hooked me. I mean, I was interested in that, but what did it actually mean? And I feel, yeah, I can say it. I think Sylvie's one of the wisest people, practically wisest people I've met. So it's actually a mother, very wise. And that was a kind of common inquiry that really came for us. And in the setting up of life itself, like we basically met, and very soon afterward, we were the original founders, and then other founders joined us. And this aspect of how do we live more wisely ourselves and our society today, and what does that actually mean? Because you kind of say, I think even many people hear word wisdom and many even have an allergic reaction of like, this is just either highfalutin, it's the kind of thing, or it's like Gandalf with a white beard or something. It's not real. It doesn't mean something for my life. And that was something we were really interested in. And that, I think, this was before we knew counted anything like John Vervaeke or the wisdom literature but you could feel it in obviously Buddhism and other things in my tradition. But what did that mean living in Western societies in the 2000s or 2010s? I mean, there's Buddhism, but what does that actually mean? What does right livelihood mean today? What does a well society mean, or a wise society mean? So yeah, that was the kind of context of our meeting. And practically, both of us, I mean, I'd certainly been doing both the meditation and contemplative path and then other things when I met Sylvie. Yeah. I mean, in fact, one of the first things I did was, go ahead.
I can say a little bit. I know that at that point you had just done quite recently, a year or so, the Landmark Forum. And I think that led to a shift in your life. And then he invited me to do the forum. And I was in a moment where I had taught at Polymoda and YED, which are two fashion universities in Florence. And I was like, it's hard to transmit, like, how do I, in teaching is mostly I wanted human flourishing, the flourishing of my student. And I was like, oh, it goes to pedagogy. And I had a friend who had committed suicide, and I felt so powerless. And I knew that there was ways in how I were with her. I knew I had I didn't know the term shadows, but there was a certain blockage in me that I didn't have the tools to be able to support her. So I think when I then met Rufus, and I myself encountered, I had done some therapy, but very lightweight. When I then we both went on to a inner development journey more through the Landmark tradition. And that was extraordinary. I encountered a lot of breakthroughs, and gradually it became like, oh my God, there's a whole collection of practices and dimension of like from, more shadow work to, healing work to this. And for me, at least, I was like, okay, you need to stick with one for a period of time to be able to go to certain depth and really get a certain discipline and practice, and then maybe explore others. So, and I think in our relationship, seeing that Rufus was someone who wanted to do this inner work for himself was extraordinary. It was very rare for me to have met anyone like that, because that meant that I had room to focus on my own, developmental journey, and that we wouldn't go in my past relationship, there was a lot of trying to fix men or save them. And so him wanting to do that for himself, that he's going to be responsible because he wants to be responsible for his inner development, meant that I can also go on that journey for myself. I do think when you're in a relationship, you do need to do that journey quite together, because otherwise at some point you're no longer on the same page, or at least it feels true for our relationship. And so how do you do that in the right pace, in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like both of you were already kind of had an inclination or, some kind of practice before you kind of met, and then coming together, it kind of amplified that, it kind of reinforced that. And, you mentioned kind of, connecting to each other, and then also connecting to a vision or to something that's kind of beyond, and moving towards that together in a parallel way. So it's kind of really a beautiful way to come together. And I'm curious then, like, how your paths, how you came up with Life Itself and like started that. And, Life Itself, I'm not even sure exactly how to describe it, because there's so much stuff that you guys do there, from the research to the practice hubs to the content you put out. So I'm really curious if you can speak a little bit more about how you understand Life Itself, how you kind of built that together.
Yeah, well, there's the history of Life Itself, but I think mostly there's a desire from the beginning, a seed of, birthing a new paradigm, seeing something else appear. At this point, it wasn't like, so there was from the origin the sense of like, we want to live more wisely, and so in the paradigm where that would put wisdom at a center. So there is a vision from the beginning. There was this vision for more wisdom, and we started. That was about 2016. Our first manifest was written late 2015, and but that wisdom is a practice. It's not a theory. So quite quickly, we wanted to kind of like have lots of small experiment, both research. What is wisdom? How do you come together? Gatherings, try to live together. So there's a loop between basically your theory, and then you put that into practice, and then your practice reinforce your theory, and it's updated. It's grounded in reality versus disembodied, theoretical, ethereal, completely in the imaginal, but can't be at the service of reality. So I think from our DNA, from the get-go of Life Itself DNA, it always had these two components. So we always had hubs from the get-go of our origin to experiment, living together, being together. And we always had certain research through the research institute or labs or writing white paper. And these were very important from our DNA. And we still, I'm a quite strong advocate that that's really important for any group that wants to actually see that change happen, that these two have to be integrated.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Rufus, do you have anything else to add of kind of how you see Life Itself and the work you've been doing there, and how you understand what Life Itself is?
Well, I think one small complementary point, because I think Sylvie put that beautifully, was the think of Life Itself as this analogy with kibbutz, which is at least one analogy I find helpful. So that kibbutz, if people don't know them, are these kind of intentional communities, often run on very communalist line, that were founded to support, they were Zionist back a century ago, which was to have a place for a home for Jews, and were often also kind of committed to sort of radical, often Marxist type social change, often they were always democratic socialist structures. And they were incredibly impactful. I mean, many, many leaders of Israel, they, founded farms, did all kinds of things. They counted for about 13% of Israeli GDP at one point, kibbutzes, in terms of production. My point of analogy, though, is just to say, Life Itself can be confusing because kibbutzes produce stuff like they, you could go to kibbutz. I've been to ones even today, and like they're producing light bulbs and they're farming oranges. And you're like, well, why are they doing some of these things? Well, that's how you sustain yourselves, or you do what you're doing. And so life itself is a collective. It's not quite a kibbutz in the sense it doesn't follow that model exactly, but we actually run a tech company. People may not even know that, which helps support what we do. We obviously do research and publish material. We run spaces where people actually come and live. We create courses and so on. Fundamentally, as Sylvie said, this aspect of both doing kind of concrete, trying to live it, and think about it, talk about it, spread the vision are the two core things that you're doing. But what I'm trying to say is underneath, we're a collective, and that's why many, many different initiatives have come out of life itself. When you asked also, you mentioned earlier the Second Renaissance, this is one specific initiative that we've helped kind of birth with others over the last few years, which is really an attempt to create that a more distilled and articulate vision and home for this new paradigm idea than just say talking about being wiser or more or wisdom. And really, it's often a synonym for integral or metamodern type ideas, the Second Renaissance term. But it is a distillation, also a helpful one of making it accessible. And that's an example of creating an initiative, but also embodying like the core paradigmatic change vision of life itself. So you could say life itself is a collective of people engaged in creating a variety of initiatives that help seed a second Renaissance, a renewal of our civilization. So, yeah.
Beautiful. And you guys have 2 physical locations, right? Right now, you guys are at the France, and then there's another one, right? And these are like, well, how would you describe kind of what these physical locations are, like what goes on there, what happens there? I imagine you guys move around, so they're kind of running whether you're there or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, so at the moment we have 2 locations, the Bergerac hub and the farmhouse hub, and they're apart from only 20, 30 minutes drive from one another.
Beautiful. Mm.
We had other hubs in the past. We had a hub in London and a hub in Berlin, and we just saw that it was difficult to run and not just to run the social, cultural network of relationship, difficult to maintain in the level of depth remote when you can't have as much proximity. The specifically the Bergerac hub, we ran a lot of praxis of like coming together, living for more short term. People would come 2 weeks to 3 months to learn to live in community, and in that also, seeing both kind of seeing like, we want to create a new world, but it's really hard because we've integrated so much of the old world in us, and how to just be with that. We have our great collaborator, Valérie Duvauchel, who has been the main leader of the inner space of that. So the experimentation of the practice, the combination to create programs where people came, and we had a couple of hundreds of people who come, and she's currently now working on an online program to be able to share these learnings that we've now accumulated over at least the past 6 years at the Bergerac Hub, so that other people can apply those learnings to their local situations. And so here at the Farmhouse Hub, our desire is to live in more co-housing. So each people have their own house, and it's more of a long-term community. So we still hold in some way our kibbutzism dream, and and we're very happy in how we're currently living, but to live more in a long-term community setup. Personally, I see that having hosted and seen a lot of people come through, which has been so nourishing to see these people and see people meeting and going on their journey. I see that the craving, at least I'm looking for, it's depth. And also I sense that that can only happen with repetition, regularity,
Mm-hmm.
and that your nervous system can start sinking in to have secure attachment, to go actually in deeper depth of relational exploration. And I actually see that actually because our space, the metamodern space, has originally come from a lot of people who might have had a nomadic life and spreading a little bit of across, and it's quite thin because it's still a very small community, that it would benefit from being able to kind of like being able to have smaller, tighter group to go deeper. And there's Rufus and I, but with Valérie and others, we have been able to do that. And I really see that there's a depth of insight, of practice, of security that allows certain experimentation that can only happen if you have I guess is the difference between like, open relationship, or a one night stand, which are wonderful at points of life to do these forms of experimentation, and like a solid long-term, relationship. There's just certain places you can't go when they're, when the turnover is high.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about right now really resonates with me, and especially like in the liminal web, like my experience, my interactions are mostly through the computer. So there is a really like a longing to be in a physical space, but a lot of the interactions, like they're like one-offs and stuff. Like I'll have a podcast with somebody, I might never speak to them again, or I might, just do some kind of a practice session or practice with somebody, and I meet them, and that might not continue. So for me, like in my own life too, there's a longing for continuity of relationship and a longing to be rooted in something. And I think like what the liminal web has been great at is it's given us a lot of perspectives, right? It's given us a lot of perspectives, and it's allowed us to kind of experiment with identities and ways of being. But I think it really doesn't help. It hasn't really helped us root, and a big thing about kind of the limitations of modernity, like, is this idea that modernity has unrooted us. Like we aren't rooted. So although we're really good at like diagnosing kind of the issue of modernity, as you said, it's like some of these things are so embedded, and it's like there's still kind of the struggle of like, how do we root? How do we come together? I was also like just kind of thinking about other places that are trying to like do similar stuff. Like I went to Monastic Academy, and it's this monastery in Vermont, and I was there for like, I imagine maybe you guys have been there too, but yeah, I was there for like 10 days. So like a lot of what they're trying to do is like kind of build a village around the monastery, so people kind of have their own places where they live, and then they're coming together. And yeah, I just been kind of hearing this. There's this kind of longing with a lot of people. I know future thinkers. They were like a prominent podcast for a while. They've started kind of building their own village, and I hear other people speaking about this kind of idea. But like I think the actually creating it is harder than kind of talking about it.
Yes. And like, I want to say it's amazing that we also see little pockets like that is Monastic Academy, or there seems to be more people around Asheville, or, Future Thinker. And yeah, it's hard because then all your like shadows or, frustration or economical pressure, all of that. And it's a commitment. It's like, oh, I like you. And it's like the commitment of having your heart broken, or financial commitment, or uprooting because you're deciding to move away. And I really see we've been able to benefit from that, of having the space, having this long-term collaboration, and yeah, I really see that this is the first. There's like being seduced by the ideas and meeting people who are kind of like these ideas, and then they're like, okay, now let's move in together, and it's a bit scary, and we have to bring a lot of like love and kindness and patience of like this. There's what, like, you have forming like this moment where you kind of create your own mini subculture, your own little way of doing, takes time. But it's also where the juice is, and that needs to then, otherwise the theory about metamodernity or this next paradigm is completely uprooted. And so that's where the benefit is of like, ooh, we need to update our theory, from the practice. And I want to say it's also, I see before we started the recording, I was sensing that I see so many amazing initiatives that are happening, or individuals that have such good heart. And I also see the vulnerability of these initiatives and these people. And it's often they interact an economical one and a psycho-emotional one, because when you have your heart so touched about wanting to experiment and do something new, one, it requires so much courage, but it's hard to go against the grain. And second, there's also such an economical vulnerability because, the world we're in is still on game A and capitalist. And it's also a moment where modernity is kind of crashing, dying. The world is burning. And so it's not like there's a lot of resource that is going towards these initiatives to do a lot of experimentation. It's like they both have to survive and experiment. And being a mother and having been interested in pedagogies, normally the best conditions for experimentation is your nervous system is relaxed, you have abundance of resource and time, and you can just go and play, and you have secure attachment. And right now, I just see this community often doesn't have these dimensions. There's huge amount of vulnerability, and and therefore, I think coming together might help reduce that vulnerability. If you're less exposed, if you're like 5, trying to figure out together to build emotional, mental resilience, but also financial resilience. But then you rub against the reality of interbeing and preferences and all of that. But I is mostly wanting to express like my love and care for all the people in the space of like, I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering also what's moving through you, Rufus, and like kind of the thread that's you've been coming up is also like the difficulty of kind of living together, and you guys have experienced a lot of people kind of visiting the hubs and kind of maybe seeing like some of the conflicts or some of the edges or things that happen. So yeah, I'm just curious if there's more you can share kind of from your experience, what's been kind of the difficulties or the challenges of
That's how vulnerable you want to be. I mean, basically, wow. I mean, I want to always start with the point that you're doing this is you want to, the other reason for Sangha is you want a commitment to something bigger than yourself. You want to remember that. And you generally are going to forget that at some point if you're just a human being. You're going to, what we say, we started this pattern with some other people called Life Guild, but this idea of, there's a beautiful line in that someone we were discussing was like, you need someone to sing your song back to you. So at some point, your song that really touched you, that you were inspired about while you're doing this, you need it sung back to you. Because it's a form of like, I was an activist in a different area for a bunch of time and started a lot of work around open information and open data and open knowledge. And in that area also, you lose the law battles. You get defeated by the interests or whatever, and you need to kind of keep having your song sung back to you at moments when you get disempowered. So first of all, there is something really beautiful. We're up to something beautiful to contribute to a better world for all in a pragmatic utopian way. Okay, all of that said, what can I say? I mean, we did intensive co-living with a 1-year-old during COVID, with at a pretty like short notice, like there was full lockdown. That was pretty intense. There was some pretty major difficulties and challenges that arose out of that. We've had co-founders or some who had left, or some who were still involved or doing different things. But if you ask people who do startups, it's the same. Many of them have got war stories about the things. But I think it's often really beautiful. But yeah, financially, it can be hard. It can be hard to sustain things. Just frankly, about the Bergerac Riverside Hub, which is amazing. I don't think it's ever. It's close to breaking even on operational cost.
Yeah.
But in terms of making something that's really viable, those things are hard. What can I say? Things like I go on the first retreat. I'm going on a retreat with my sister, my partner at Plum Village for the first time. It's like, finally, this July, I'm not managing the hub or whatever it is. I think it's 2023. I'm 2 days into the retreat. Oh, the boiler's completely broken down. There are 16 people in the hub who are using it. There's no hot water. It's July in France, which is not a good time to find a plumber. Let me tell you, in France, they're on holiday. It's just like, the pragmatics of it is it can. We saw, we've seen groups. There was a group who ran the hub. I don't want to go, like they fall out. This like it's hard. But the beauty is, like, all of this I was saying is that it's hard doing also startups or whatever it is you choose to get up to. It's not as hard to watch Netflix or even just do your everyday job. But it's also harder when you care about something. Like it's like, and the thing is, one of the things actually always at Landmark was like, what most of the way when we get our heart broken romantically or whatever, many of us make decisions in life. Like, I'm never going to love again, or all men are jerks, or all women are X, or I'm just going to throw myself at the first person who comes along. I'm whatever. We all get into things said or unsaid, and the same can happen to our love and romance with making a difference or whatever inspires us in this area, which is we're vulnerable. When we make ourselves vulnerable for a dream, we can be disappointed. One person said to me, even recently, like someone said a bit cynically to me, they're like, oh, this space we're in, we all talk about game B, but there's a lot of game A going on, and I'm like, yeah, there is. But I guess for me, one of my superpowers I feel in life, I have one, is that I have deep down, like an immense love for humanity. Like, and I mean that, but like since I was a kid, I also meant the desire, I'm never going to give up. So, for me, it started on the playground. I'm 8 years old. And it's like, did kids get bullied if they had glasses or they were fat? Or I get picked on because of whatever I was doing? Why couldn't we have a world when no one did that? Where every like kids' school was fun to go to? And then the other thing for me, though, as a child, and I'm just kind of going, was that, hey, if we joined together, if only what I realized was there was a few bullies, there were a few kind of victims, and then there were 80% in the middle. And if the 80% in the middle just wouldn't go along with the bully, we'd be fine. Now, it was my first failure in collective action. I have to be honest that I didn't persuade the 80% to stand up to the bully. But my point is, I never give up. And I never give up on people. But you have got to be, when you do this, it's like going into a really juicy relationship. If you really open your heart to someone, you really love somebody, then you're always going to be vulnerable to having your heart broken. Whereas if you never really love, you can never really be hurt. And similarly, when you have dreams about how we can change society and so on. And we also need to make sure they don't become nightmares, because that's happened in the past. But leaving that aside, just here, we're non-violent, we're all peaceful, we're we're non-dogmatic, etc. But even there, we have dreams. We have dreams about our collaborations with people. We have dreams about the difference we can make and so on. And the biggest thing, as I said, is, again, to go to something Sylvie said, the importance of using the Buddhist term Sangha. And by Sangha is not community, by the way. I mean, people use the community term as a synonym. Sangha is community with common purpose and common practice. In traditional Buddhist Sangha, that doesn't mean it's the only thing you're doing, but your aspiration is enlightenment. Your common aspiration is to I mean, at the base level, nirvana. And the other is you've got some common practices. But if you've got Sangha of some kind, and it could be looser or stronger, and those people are there to sing your song back to you, to remember, hey, we're up to here to make the radically wiser, weller heart world our hearts know is possible. We know we could stop messing up, destroying the planet, or, we could have, as my friend Liam used to call it, sustainable well-being. Like, we could actually be really happy on the resources that we need, for the planet to work. We can do these things. They're very hard. They're simple and they're hard. And we need to never give up. And most of the time, I'm just going to say this, one of the biggest tragedies I've ever experienced, and it's the same as when I have a friend who's a monk at Prom Village and they disrobe. But the greatest tragedy is when you see, for me, when people give up on the dream. And I've seen that quite a bit. And sometimes the bigger the dream, the bigger the disappointment. And then the bigger the kind of like, well, I'm out. I'm just going to go earn money and do X or Y or Z, and there are practical things that I want to come back. I've said a lot that Sylvie's talked about that we can do. We want to find ways to provide more material sustainability to each other. Why the kibbutz again? We want to provide also, most importantly, psycho-spiritual kind of sustainability and support to each other. But yeah, these things are the biggest. And those are the biggest tragedies for me personally, often are losing fellowship on the path, for whatever reason.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but I noticed, Sylvie, you wanted to say something, so I wonder if that's still there for you.
There's a billion things I could say.
Say all of them.
For whatever reason, I can tell you a big reason, in my view, is shadows. Like, shadows is like underrated, in my view, in this community compared to maybe spiritual, work. And what I mean by spiritual, maybe pursuing meditation, enlightenment.
Transcending. Yeah.
Versus like, let me battle with my demon. I think most communities, group organization break down because of, lack of practice of being able to reconcile with our own shadow, how they resonate with one another, and allowing the space to just be with that. And then sometimes there's also just things are maybe less dramatic, but work style preferences, like personality match preferences. But I would say that the biggest thing is I would say shadow work, in my view. Every time your pattern, your attachment pattern, your pattern with your parents always show up. They always show up in any collective. Your whatever. And the issue sometimes I think we confuse is that then we think we should heal that in the collective. Like, let's do a lot of emotional process. And then that drains the group in then doing the work. And I think there can be some spaciousness for that. But I'm starting to sense that there might be a wisdom to decouple, where is it that you do your healing work, your shadow work, that maybe you do that separately in a container for that versus, we're gonna try to fix all the game A and modernity's problem as we do it. It's like, no, I'm not. Like, parts of me, I'm like, I can speak for myself. Parts of me, I'm very have many traces of modernity. And I'm like, if I'm trying to try to fix that before I get to work, I never get anything done. It's like, okay, I'm gonna address these things at the pace that I can. And I'm, not trying to make myself like I want to grow innerly, but I also have to radically accept where I'm at and where the world is at versus constantly be self-disappointed and disappointed about the space and the state of the world. And also like, it's like you let the best not be the enemy of the good, in the sense of if you try to kind of like get everything sorted before you start trying to do it, it's like, well, I don't know, I'm like a modernist in rehab. And so it's like, it's going to take time to kind of like, and I'm going to fall on my face, and we're all going to fall on our face. And, but it doesn't mean that I need to try to be completely sober before I try, meeting with other and getting things done and improving. Yeah. I don't know if I got the metaphor right, but,
I like that. I like the modernist in rehab. That's a good one. And I definitely agree and resonate with the whole shadow work thing. And I think that's actually a huge thing. Like, kind of the modern ideology is about just kind of functioning from the ego. There's this overlooking the unconscious. And I find that in a lot of these kind of spaces, people get very curious about kind of the unconscious stuff and the shadow stuff and, the things that kind of bother us. The person that really triggers us, that really pisses us off. Well, there's something there that's probably in me that I'm not seeing. And I think that's a really big orientation that allows us to kind of bridge gaps between people. Whereas like, if you don't have that orientation of like, oh, the thing that's pissing me off about this person is maybe there's something there in myself. It's kind of hard to bridge these gaps. But, the other thing you guys were kind of saying that I kind of struggle with is this whole notion of game A and game B. It's like, I'm not really sure what game B is. And it seems like maybe the people that are kind of living game B, they've already won game A. So it's like, if you won in game A, it's kind of easier to think, well, I don't have to stress about kind of money. You mentioned that, the hub like barely breaks even or whatever. It's like not really making money. So it's not a good business. Like I imagine there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I would like to create this. Like it would be like my dream business. Like I know for me, there's definitely that kind of idea of like, I would love to have a space like this where people come together and do practice. But then it's like, is it really making money? So it's like, you mentioned you have the tech company, which allows you to, maybe build finances and finance all this other stuff. But yeah, there is this challenge of like the modern man or the modern woman inside and being embedded in kind of this system. And it's like seeing the limitations of it, but we're not really sure like how, like we're still in it, So it's like, how do we maneuver that?
I would go to the extent that I don't think game B is at all there, like we're not, and we would kid ourselves to, it's like because there's maybe, I think game B or metamodernity, if we really, really look at it, I think it's actually pointing to a lot of like really ancient also religion, which is we require an ontological transformation, a transformation of what it means to be a human being. It's like all religion, all is like say, I don't know, don't be greedy, don't kill. Easy to say, hard to do as we see the wars escalating. And it's, and so I think why most is like, okay, love and kindness to ourselves. And yes, like, and also from the outside, it can seem, oh, there is, maybe the hub going and people coming together. And the idea of it is like, and I think also the space is starting to mature where people are starting to have practice, like kind of putting the theory into practice and realize the difficulty. And to the honor of that space is like a lot of people are still around, not quitting, continuing, readjusting. And that's where it gives me a lot of hope. I'm like, yes, you've survived, let's say, first winter. And two, it's just that you do it. It's already hard in game A. It's going to be very like to even do a business, like we have the startup business was hard to do. And it's still hard to keep it going. So there's, I guess, this, the path of what we say, maybe, it can be a joyful path. But it's not one for maybe the weak heart in a sense that, it is going to be, how to say, if one wants easy, don't sign up. Stay in
Yeah.
modernity. Just enjoy the ride and enjoy the crash. But if you if you want next paradigm, it's going to be a profound, deep joy journey, a hard, profound, joyful journey. I think it's like, I can speak our relationship, Rufus and I, if we go full circle to the beginning of the question. It's been so profound. It's been so soulful to become interbeing with one another, become so exposed and vulnerable and seen and pick each other up that but can I say it's been easy? No, it's been hard, but it's been deep and meaningful and worthy. So I think that's more why I want to say, if you want it easier than game A or modernity, not going to be easier, but more deep, more meaningful, where you'll get to know yourself better. That I think, yes, that offer is on the table.
I don't know if I can build on that, Artem.
Yeah, you definitely can. Yeah.
There's some we like historical analogies a lot because it helps, I think, make some of the things we're talking about concrete for a broader audience as well. And one that if we think of the story of like cultural paradigms or like modernity, there's post-modernity, metamodernity, and pre-modernity, so on. What do these mean? So one is to go back to ancient Rome. And let's say you're in the declining Roman Empire. Would have not been apparent, by the way, it was so declining to most people. But let's say from 250 to 350, the Common Era. And a story I really love that comes from David Sloan Wilson's book, actually, I first found it in Darwin's Cathedral. It's about this young Roman. It's a true story, right? We know it from later stuff. So he's kind of rich, pretty well off. He's going to the circus one day, and he's kind of bored. It's like the Netflix of the time. Let's see some gladiators fight it out. But in this today, it's the Christians getting ripped apart by the lions. And he's in the circus, and he sees these Christians die with the wild animals. And something strikes him. There's something in their eyes that he does not have and that he will never have despite all his money. There's something like, whether it's kind of a peace or a purpose, despite the fact they're dying, that they have. And this plants a seed. He goes, in the end, he gives away all his money. He becomes basically a Christian saint. He ends up himself dying, I think, in the circus or something, but he goes off, converts to Christianity. And my point, I actually remember talking with Jim Rutt about this, was often people think we're going to kind of I don't know, I thought this at one point, like, hey, the new paradigm, we'll be better, we'll be better at running companies. You see this in books like Reinventing Organizations, we'll be better. And my point is that Christianity did not offer better. It was not going to do the Roman army better than the Romans were doing. It was not going to run the Roman Empire better. It offered meaning and purpose. And we are a grandchild of Christianity. I mean, really, it's postmodernism is that in the sense that modernity was the grandchild of Roman. Modernity is imperial. It's about more, better, conquering the world in many ways. Modernity has done, whatever ways, right? This, I think, is about meaning and purpose. I mean, that's almost the core of the meaning crisis. People are bereft. And I think that's the thing we're offering. We're not offering, Christians never said, and I'm not saying you're going to die in the circus, but the Christian offering was not, this is going to be easy. This is like the easy path. It's like, this is going to be freaking hard, but it's going to be meaningful and purposeful. It's going to be redemptive. It's going to be powerful. And you can make a difference, and you'll have brotherhood and sisterhood. And so I think those are the things that are there. So first of all, that's one point I just wanted to make. And it's not a surprise that we kind of, our podcast, the evolving lifestyle podcast is the Over the Mountains. And the metaphor there was, in Lord of the Rings, there's this moment where, they're trying to go to Mount Doom, and they're like, we need to cross these mountains. And they're, I don't know if you've seen the film or read the book, and like they're going, and then, I think it's I don't think it's Sauron. I think Saruman is like sending, the winds. They we can't do it. It's too hard. And like the dwarf says, like, there's this shortcut, guys. We can go back and go through the mountains. And we live in a world that is absolutely beloved of shortcuts, right? Web3 and crypto, we'll solve coordination problems. Whatever it is, we'll live forever. We'll upload ourselves to AI. You name it. And what happens in Lord of the Rings, I think very true. They go through the shortcut. And if it was by any kind of honest book, that would have been the end of the book, because they go through the shortcut. If in the book, they go through, it's a trap. They go through the halls, and the Balrog shows up and takes out Gandalf. Now, because it's a kind of fiction book, somehow Gandalf is reborn as Gandalf the White, and it's all okay. But in any normal book, that would have been it. Your star player's out of the game. You're stuck in the kind of this place. It would have been a game over. And we need to confront in a kind of deep way that it's possible, which is, by the way, confronting, because one option is cynicism. It's all over. We'll never defeat Sauron. We should just give in and join the dark side, or
and it's comfortable also. Cynicism can feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
I was building on you.
Yeah, you are building on it. Keep going if you want to, there's a point.
Hope is the willingness to suffer. Are you willing to suffer? To have your heart broken, to fail, to still hope? And I think there's no shortcut to doing the shadow work and peeling the layer, to try and be disappointed by ourselves. And I think and it doesn't mean like, hey, we need to be martyr and dwell in it. And
it can be joyful going over the mountains. It can be joyful. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Well, I just want to add, like, the thing that also there is that, and the thing of going to the mountains is both the inner work that Sylvie's talking about, and there's basically the real point is it's collective action. Most of the challenges that we have in transforming our society are collective action problems. I know in our speak, maybe I should use the term Pollock, but where I grew up in political science, like collective action problems, and they aren't unsolvable. Like, the great story is we have throughout the history of humanity found ways to collaborate at larger scales. We've also been confronted at larger scales, but it's not necessarily been easy. There's a load of difficulties, but I'm just saying that we have done that. And this goes something to also really key, that where insights is, so we kind of say in the beginning, like, even a strong term, like they can kind of be insight wanking. You get so excited about your insights. So when I came across Integral, like I found the keys, I found the quadrants, but like we have to practice. But I want to say there's one important insight I think also I want to emphasize here is we don't all have to wake up and become Buddha. We don't have to transform all our shadows. The story of humanity is that there's a dance, I think, where we create cultural structures, most obviously religions, for example, which serve to kind of support the better angels of our nature. We create social structures, we create sanghas, we create states, we create police forces or so on. We do things that kind of do both things, where I think we can become better, and I think there is a genuine potential for betterment and goodness in all of us, and practice, and we can transform, and maybe that is happening. And we create these cultural structures. And we'd like to talk about this. I think the metaphor, we keep looking for good metaphors, of one of them is the soil and the seeds. So underneath is our human nature, and we can get very pessimistic, like we're just greedy. Or we can go the other way, like we're all just good, but we're corrupted by society. I don't buy either of those. Like, we've got both. Buddhism teaches we've got the good seeds, and we've got wholesome seeds, and we've got unwholesome seeds. What I like is the metaphor of the soil is the culture we're in. So why that can be so powerful is a lot easier in some ways to shift culture than it is to completely, to transform 7 billion people's human nature. That takes time. But culture is kind of, well, which seeds germinate? So if I'm in a culture which is all about greed is good, success is about money and about winning and so on, well, that's going to really nurture the seeds of competition and greed in me. If I'm in a soil that's really nourishing the seeds of like, okay, cooperation or other things, and that's why culture can make such a difference. And, to go back to Christianity, the extraordinary achievement of Christianity, whatever you may think of it now, was that it basically taught, at the beginning at least, radical brotherhood and sisterhood, at least within the Sangha of the Christian church. You loved your brother and sister like your brother and sister. And, going even on to Protestantism, the famous, breakthroughs of like, God is watching you. It may sound a bit, we now look down on Calvinists and all these people, but the fact that there was God there with your conscience all the time meant, well, I'm going to be good a lot more because there's someone who's there, even when no one else is watching, checking up on me. And while we may now find that, we watch, you can read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, or, The Crucible, and there are all these things that happen that could become deformed out of, that kind of Protestantism. But there was also something incredible in terms of supporting levels of cooperation. There was a reason that Puritan merchants were really honest. There's a reason you buy Quaker oats. In a world where you couldn't trust whether people had adulterated your oats with rubbish, whether they'd put other rubbish in your food, there wasn't a food standards agency. I trust a Quaker. Quakers are really, really, really honest because of their religion. I'm going to buy Quaker oats. That's why Quaker oats are so successful. So these things, really, culture can make a massive difference and can operate a lot quicker than us all having to become Buddhas. Of course, we can need to do both. And to loop back, what Sylvie is partly pointing to is that if you want to build the pockets, so how is cultural shifting happening as a civilization? It doesn't happen everywhere all at once. It happens in dense pockets where people are experimenting with new forms of culture, new forms of organizing. And in those pockets right now, doing the shadow work, doing this other work, and deconstructing maybe our habits of modernity and other things, and reconstructing, and also dealing with deep aspects of human nature. It isn't just modernity's fault, right? We have a 1.5-year-old, so we could say, and she's got jealousy for sure in her. Sometimes when our older brother is getting something and she's not. But I'm just saying that, coming back to the point, which is we need these pockets of denseness. That's where, before the culture spreads everywhere, there's small clusters of Christians back in there, that period. And it's particularly key in those groups to do this inner work. That in those kind of pockets, because we're trying to cooperate in new ways, we're trying to deal with money in new ways, we're trying to, not have the old breakdowns that pulled us apart and went back to like, well, I'll just live in my house and watch Netflix, and you stay in your house and watch Netflix on a different program. We're going to try and do things together. That's where the shadow work, the inner work, is so, so crucial in developing these pockets.
Yeah, there's a couple of threads I want to throw out, and I want to see what you guys think about it. A lot of what you are sharing, Rufus, is making me think about. So there's, one of the conversations in kind of liminal web, I'm sure you guys are entrenched in that conversation, is kind of this idea between wisdom and power. And there's actually a lot of threads that come up. Like one, there's this guy, the scientist Donald Hoffman, and he basically says that our eyes kind of deceive us, that in a way that we see a reality in a way, not necessarily how it actually is, but in a way that helps us survive. And then that, it kind of makes me think about also a lot like the Buddhist practice or meditation. There's a lot of this orientation of kind of seeing through solidity, right? Seeing through the kind of how real things are, seeing through the illusory nature, kind of seeing through the world. And then if you see that how, the world works, like understanding how the world works and how the average person works is very different. Like most people don't have a deep meditation practice. They're not trying to see kind of the illusory or kind of like the emptiness of self. They're not doing that. I think about also like Sam Harris, right? And he's somebody with a committed meditation practice and somebody who's kind of like a prominent figure in the space. And he would give this, he would compare himself to Tolkien Ergen, who was this great Dzogchen master who was like one of his teachers who kind of pointed him to the nature of mind. And he's like, this guy just hung out in awareness, right? Like he just hung out in awareness, and that's where he rested. And he's like, I can't really do that, and Sam is very engaged with philosophy and politics and how the world works and all these kind of things. And, it's almost like there's these two threads, right? Of like wisdom is in a way kind of seeing through, is seeing to the emptiness, is seeing through the world. And power is actually understanding how does the world operate? How does the average person operate? And this, this also, Rufus, ties to kind of human nature. Are we good or are we bad? Right. And I think that from my understanding, from the Buddhist perspective, it's like actually our true nature, we're good. We're fundamentally good. Right. But if you see people operating in politics and they're going to have this more kind of skeptical, like the average person is kind of greedy. It's like, it's very easy to love humanity, right? Like, I mean, you even said that, like, oh, I love humanity. And I believe that you mean that, but it's actually a lot harder to love your neighbor, like the specific person that's like pissing you off, right? It's like, because it stops being this abstract thing, it becomes real. So there's, even in like political spaces, there's this argument of like, about human nature. There's this argument about, well, how do people operate? Like, are people actually greedy? It's like, and we're dealing with, like you mentioned, there's different cultures. So like being in a certain community where everybody's loving and trusting it, and those qualities start becoming cultivated in yourself. And if you're in a community or you're in a culture that's not like that, the other things. So yeah, I don't know. There's just this kind of thread for me that I'm seeing, that this thread between wisdom and power. And even in my own journey, I'm like, there's something that's being realized through my meditation practice. And then it's like, oh, Buddhism doesn't have social theory. There's no social theory there, right? And then it's like, I'm like, well, like I orient to my meditation teacher as somebody who's very wise. And at the same time, it's like, well, he's essentially, a lot of his work is just teaching meditation and going on retreat. And that's what he's doing, right? So it's like he's orienting in a particular way, right? Like maybe he's not thinking about geopolitics, right? Or about political stuff, and that's when I start looking at other threads. Actually, we need other threads and other perspectives. And like, I've been listening to this guy, Professor Jiang. He has this thing about predictive history, and he does a lot of stuff on geopolitics. And when I kind of flip to that frame, that's a very different feeling, right? There's a lot more kind of skepticism. There's a lot more of like, you got to watch how nations are maneuvering and kind of like what they're doing to kind of gain power and do that. So it's very different ways of orienting. And I think they afford different things. And I'm very curious of like, can we go very deep into both? Can we integrate both of these things? But yeah, these are just some thoughts. I'm curious what pops up for either of you, for both of you.
I love those reflection and question. I've been grappling with them for a long time, like the principle of nonviolence. Well, how do you apply that? What is wise? What is my attachment? Like a lot of, the apps are nonviolence. And then when you look at the state of the world, and it's like, and is it always wise?
And is sometimes violence necessary, for example? Are there times when that's necessary?
Is it not necessary, but like, and I as I actually sometimes share with Rufus or other Buddhist practitioners or monks, what I come to, at least in Buddhism, is not that it's like a command of like, you shall never, but it's more like it is a principle, but you gotta, and also compassion and you gotta, it has to be contextual. And I think the distinction for me a bit about wisdom, one important dimension of wisdom, it is that it is found grounded in experience and it needs to be practiced. So something that you do in one context might seem wise and another one might not. And there's also a sense of, and what is good for also the collective and the individual, how to do that dance. And I think that's where I get excited, because it gets practice. It's like juicy. It's real, okay, how, and I do sense in my heart that in every human being, there is fundamental goodness. And actually, when I look in my own experience, we've often caused pain, maybe not so much from intentional desire to cause harm, but full of good intention and full of self-delusion.
Yeah, ignorance, yeah.
And there is not, like, at least in the West, we've always grew up with this depiction of a great villain and a great hero. And there's good people and there's bad people, and bad people do bad thing. But my experience is like good people do shit things. Not even from a bad place. And I'm one of them. I'm one of them. Misunderstanding, miscommunication, self-delusion, difficulty to be honest with oneself. And it's paved by that. And actually, we've looked in history. You don't need to go that far back, or if I take what's happening in the US with Trump, like many good people voted for Trump. They're not bad people. They're not all bad people, and what has happened in Germany before with Hitler and Nazi, you can't sort of say like all of Germany at that time were bad, and so that's actually going to be much harder to confront, because then you need to look at yourself and be like, whoa, where is my self-delusion? Where is my being? And it's easier to other the other. And I just see that so much in the conversation of like pointing fingers versus grappling with like the complexity of what it is to be human being, that we all have seeds of goodness. And we also all have seeds of, the 7 sins, greed and fear.
Obscurations, another way to think of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And what are the we can create, there are definitely conditions that will nourish certain seeds. And I do think that's the separation also between politics and religion was very healthy and for good reason. But I also think that what Rufus mentioned is that has been one of the aim, I think, in many religion is to try to nourish the good seeds. Now everything calcifies. Yeah. Everything at some point often calcifies, become corrupt. And that's why it's just like, well, what we have at task is really a transformation of what it means to be human beings. And coming to the concrete of power, I think also there's often a shadow about our relationship to power, that we think power is bad and corrupt, or how we relate to politics, that politicians by default are, corrupt and etc. And these are very strong narratives. Some people had real interest in you believing in these forms of narrative, and then they become self-fulfilling prophecies. But politics is basically coming together and trying to resolve collective action problems, and sitting together with our, imperfect humanness. I don't know if I offered an answer, but I can say that yes, there and not all religion you can't ask every one religion or all religion to have resolved everything. Yep. But I think one thing that I'm quite interested is that, for example, maybe Buddhism has been quite a monastic tradition, but Christianity has a strong lay tradition. At least Protestantism has a strong lay foundation, and these are things that definitely sparks my interest at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Vajrayana has there's a lot of kind of more householder and kind of this people living lay lives and kind of going off to the cave, doing a quick meditation, coming back. So I think Buddhism also has threads of more so a household. I think my practice, like the Mahamudra practice, it's known as like the householder path. So there is also that. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, maybe just to add, I think you were pointing to something. So let's say you got, just to kind of come back even to the theory of change set out to establish in the Second Renaissance white papers, which are a distillation of, I'd say, like integral thinking and metamodern thinking into a kind of what would be a theory of change, or how do you go to a new paradigm. And it's not the answer, but you need, I think, more concrete hypotheses help. because you can actually look at. So one question, you've got these pockets formed. You've got places where people are going to try out operating these ways. We've talked about earlier in the call why that's so important, because you can theorize about this, but then you actually, have to go do it. And for material reasons like money and finance and spiritual reasons, you want to be together. And then you'd say, well, one of the things we think is key, what are these pockets? Are there any features of these kind of pockets that we can discern that should be there? One is, I think they've got some envisioning, even if there's a variety of those of towards new paradigm and what that new paradigm looks like. There's some commonality, because there can be a bewildering otherwise variety of those. But the second I think we want to focus on here is what we call they're doing conscious community, or they're a developmental space. We've got this paper on developmental spaces. And this is basically integral. This is really integral in other work. Integral is often a synthesis. But something you were alluding to that I think was really amazing, Artem, was saying, okay, there are often these people we think are very wise who are contemplative teachers or from spiritual traditions. And something I think Wilbur pointed out really well, like several times his work, was like, but there's this weird aspect where that doesn't, we've often assumed that if you're like really wise Buddhist saint, then therefore you know what to do about climate change kind of thing. Like you'll know what's wise action to take there. And that's kind of not true, it seems. And in that piece, we're really spelling out the waking up, cleaning up, growing up, at least dimensions. And I mean, you'll be familiar with these, but just to reiterate to people, okay, this is just a major insight I think that Wilbur and others are distilling, is saying, listen, in a development, and you could say collective development of a group, isn't just about like waking up, i.e. doing contemplative, working up to my true nature, dwelling in suchness. That can be very valuable. It can lead me to feel much more loving kindness, much less attached to my ego, all kinds of things. And that's quite distinct from shadow work. And I mean, I think the example I refer to often at the moment is Kuladasa, who people may come across the mind illuminate. I think someone who's clearly on the path had a major breakdown in his Sangha, in which his ex-wife accused him of things and so on. What for me is extraordinary is you can find his 35-page letter about what happened. And what's fascinating about that, so I think personally, I come away thinking Kuladasa was actually pretty decent and didn't do much. But he's saying that letter, he's like, oh, I realized at the end I had these kind of shadows from my childhood of harm that I was actually basically spiritually bypassing. And I had not done this. And this is this major insight is it turns out that the spiritual path, at least sometimes as it can be presented, because strictly there might be a load of other things in other traditional lineages where you're doing that, but you're also doing prostrations and you're doing ethical work and so on. But if you're not careful, you miss out on the shadow work, and you need to do what I'm saying, shadow work, like cleaning up our issues with our parents, with our, that show up in all our relationships, all those other things. And finally, there's the growing up, there's the worldview change. So again, why can you have a racist Zen master? Well, if a Zen master grows up in an era where it's just kind of like the worldview we're living in, that X group are different, then that's possible, it seems. Just as like Buddha, I mean, you can read the stories, like Buddha was having difficulty ordaining women. It was like, he could deal with untouchables, that he could break that taboo, but it was like he lived in such an era of patriarchy that it was just hard for him to be like, either he didn't think that, but he was just seeing the patriarchy around him, or he actually thought that. And you're like, hey, the true enlightened being was struggling with patriarchy. It's like, well, these things go deep. So I think the point is you're looking then for communities where you get to do intertwined practices that work on each of those, on the waking up, the cleaning up, the shadow work, and the worldview shift. Now that and that also leads you into, like, for example, then having a political or social program that's richer than just sit on your cushion and become enlightened. You start seeing like, okay, well, we could teach combination of these in school. We could support people at least becoming to reflect on their worldview, all of these other things. So like you start to have social and political programs that would naturally come out of this in a very positive way that kind of complements what otherwise can be a rather like, just meditate or just go and pray. There's no real guidance on what will that mean socially and politically in terms of how we run society in any way. Yeah.
Have anything else to add, Sylvie?
No, I thought, thank you so much for having us. It was really joyful to share with you.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple more questions if you guys
Yes.
if you guys are good. Yeah.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll ask this question. You know, a big theme of your work is the meta crisis, and what you're calling a second renaissance is like a potential pathway to move through it. I know you're actually starting a 4-week course on that today. I think it's right after this podcast. But, in one of your white papers, you speak about the shift from a polycrisis framing, which is more about surface level stuff like think renewable energy, better AI regulation, improved governance, to a meta crisis framing, which is really about changing our worldview, identity, perspective. And that's a vital shift, because if we don't get to the root of our problems, we'll just keep perpetuating them in one form or another. Now, it seems to me that a certain type of person, let's say someone you find in the liminal web, for them the meta crisis framing just intuitively rings true. And I think back to the human transformation at the time of Meta Crisis Conference, and I'd wager that most people there were already kind of on board with this idea. And to me, the challenge is that most people in the broader population are either completely unaware of this framing, or when they encounter it, it just doesn't land. And I think especially those with like a rational optimist or techno-optimist worldview, which is a perspective that's held by many technologists, people that have disproportionate influence over how our society is being shaped, they probably would struggle with the meta crisis framing. And I tried to get Jason Crawford, he's a prominent progress advocate, into a dialogue with Zach Stein, and it never ended up happening. But to me, that kind of exchange feels crucial. Like, even when I think about the human transformation conference, I was like, oh, it would be so great if we had, somebody with a kind of techno-optimist view to kind of be in a dialectical with somebody that's kind of holding more of like the meta crisis awareness. So it's like the question I keep coming back to is, how do we create spaces for genuine kind of good faith dialogue between kind of these two camps that maybe have very different views? Like, how do we design something, a coherence, a conversation that holds this dialectical tension where there's enough difference in perspectives to be generative, and enough mutual respect for the dialogue to actually go somewhere? Because otherwise it feels that we're kind of like circling the same ideas with the same people, and we could get stuck in an echo chamber. Maybe also this ties into, you talk about the pocket. It's like, oh, we can build change on a local ground level, which that's very important. Maybe that's the pathway, is kind of this grassroots. But then there's also this question of impact, right? Like, how do we have more impact? How do we maybe we need to somehow accelerate? Maybe we need to have these bigger kind of dialogues. So this is just kind of something I see you have something, Sylvie. Curious.
Yeah, burning with like a billion things here. One, I would say absolutely dialogue. But is it dialogue from an open-hearted place? Do you actually really want to be in conversation? Or is it just going to be another duel? And instead of using, swords, you're using words, and I think that's a crucial thing. And so maybe it's not so much sometime like being able to find the famous name, but just even like within your friend groups that you grew up with, or people, colleagues, can you start having just like conversations that just feels a little edgy? That's already a growth path in terms of even for ourselves and spreading. And two, I think it has a lot more about how you show up in your way of being when you have those conversations. Like, I need to sometimes catch myself like, oh, people feel one's way of being. Are we bringing lots of like groundedness, kindness, listening, ability to like get the other, like how we're being is going to cut through so much more.
than what we're saying. Yeah.
And then what you're saying will start to land because and that's a hard thing of like, oh, the embodiment, okay, in the theory. And then I sometimes get like, you know, overexcited and like attached and like, I don't feel get it. I was like, okay, unwind. So I would say this, you mentioned also, you mentioned so many things, but like these are the two I can really sense now in the top of my head. It's like how we being when we have those conversations doesn't need to be on a public podcast, but just, you know, 1-on-1, 2-on-2. I think also 1-on-1 are usually better because when you're in a group, there's often this like protecting your identity.
Yeah.
And two, for us, and thirdly, why we did the Second Renaissance website and project is to distill those ideas and make them accessible. I'm like, oh, it's wonderful that there's these massive books, you know, to read, but my grandmother, you know, or my mother, we need those ideas to be much shorter, much more accessible, very simple messaging that the average person can start grappling themselves around, but they're still in the realm of idea. And for me, particularly why I have a passion about art starts to be an embodiment. Art starts to move people. People rarely change their mind. People rarely freaking change their freaking mind. But when people change, there's moments where people might change their mind. They encounter a massive breakdown in their life or in their society, and they're like, oh, something's really the matter. Almost I don't have a choice than to change my mind. Or two, they're so moved in their heart. We managed to touch something in their soul that had been maybe protected, calcified, a sense of hope, a sense of love, that then once their heart is open, they're much more therefore then willing to shift their sense of identification. And when I say their sense of identification, it's not just what I think is possible, what I think is true, what I'm attached in terms of what is right that we should do in society. And I think that's why art, in my view, has a huge role in that, in sense of like moving people, touching people. I think religion has a huge part in that. That's why I did the Mythos magazine. It's like we need new stories, stories touch us, but also sometimes reappropriating old tradition and giving them a rebirth. Renaissance means rebirth, like decaying what needs to be let go of in them that are corrupted, and because religion is practicing together, is brotherhood and sisterhood, is touching, linking ourselves and letting ourselves being touched by the kindness and generosity of other human being, and practicing showing up that kindness and generosity and compassion. And so that these are all about our way of being as a space. You know, why would people want to join or spread? How is that going to spread if basically one of like, I think, and happiness is a practice. Happiness is a practice in the sense that, why would people want to join if they see us miserable? Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's easy, but like, and happiness is contagious. And in a way, also, there's moments where we have to go into the depth of the difficulty. And if there hasn't been huge grounders of like love, care, joy, you don't have the emotional, psychological resource to go in the descent, to go into like the difficult moment. So yeah, definitely go talk with people. I might partially sometime the podcast, and has been for me doing those, like discussing maybe with whatever. I would definitely want to discuss that with ideas that I'm like, I feel a bit uncomfortable, but who I do it with is really important. I like that there's both this kind of wanting to care for one another and generally wanting to understand one another is a foundation. Otherwise, you actually contract and then both party contract, and you leave further apart when actually the intention of the dialogue was to start getting closer.
I think, though, you also had a question, Artem, was maybe how to communicate to other audiences. Like, one could speak to somewhat the converted.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was your question, and how to speak.
Yeah.
So one of the, in the secular Renaissance structure, one of the reasons of having that is like trying to think of ways we can speak to broad audience, just even using the term secular Renaissance, because at least in the West, and even so in Taiwan, people know what the Renaissance is roughly. They have a kind of very vague sense. There was some like renewal or rebirth, and the word in French at least means renewal or rebirth. And the analogy, even if imperfect or somewhat Eurocentric, because obviously this new Renaissance won't happen in Europe or anything, or the West necessarily might happen anywhere in the world or many places. But to say one of them, so to say, is a teaching structure, is the forced parts that come from medicine. And so first you want to see where people are at. Like that structure, just to go through it, is one, symptoms. What signs are there that our society is unwell in some way? Secondly, what is the diagnosis? And this is actually normally the crucial point. I'll come to that. Third is, okay, what's prognosis? Is recovery possible? Can we get better? And fourth, what's the treatment? That's the structure. Obviously, it's used in Buddhism in the Four Noble Truths by Buddha. This is the structure we use in the Second Renaissance of polycrisis is the symptoms, metacrisis is the diagnosis. Basically, Renaissance is the prognosis. Rebirth is possible. Renewal is possible. And then, what is the path? That is quite open. We have this idea of these pockets and movement building. But to come back, it's also useful to ask where people are at. If you're having a conversation with someone and they're like, well, things are going fine, there aren't any symptoms, then obviously you're going to have a very different, there's no point having a discussion about the metacrisis yet, because what I'm at least meaning by the metacrisis is they don't even agree that, if they don't think there's a serious ecological crisis going on, or they don't think that there's a major wisdom gap around existential technologies. By that, I mean, we're not able to govern or manage technologies which now could kill us all, from nuclear weapons through to super intelligence. If they don't think that, then you got to start there and have a discussion, and not like make them wrong, but just be like, okay, so what do you think? And obviously, it's like if you're having discussion with someone and they're like, I'm not ill, yes, all that bleeding out of my leg, that's not a problem. It's fine. I like it, And I say that because I had someone who'd act like an uncle to me when I was a kid. Really grew up on a farm. He worked on the farm with us. He was an amazing guy, and he had hurt his hip really badly, actually playing a lot of cricket. He was a bowler and you land on your leg. And he needed a hip replacement for probably 15 or 20 years before he had one. And he would often say, I'm not in pain. I don't have a problem. And the truth was, the tragic truth, by the way, of Shadow again, was his wife had died due to medical negligence in hospital. And he was like, I'm never going near a hospital again. That was beneath the surface. I'm just trying to say is many people, and this is a point again about shadow work, our experience has been, and we did a whole course originally now 8 years ago on blind spots, which is if you're talking to most people, you can't even see what you can't see. That's a blind spot, right? What you don't know is actually not a problem. If you put me in a jumbo jet and say fly, and I'm like, but I don't know how to fly a jumbo jet. I'm not going to, but if I think I can fly a jumbo jet when I can't, that's a problem, and the issue, for example, around what you're describing about technology in our society, we just put out a white paper on this, is technology is possibly, I would say, almost our biggest blind spot. We have become absolutely infatuated by technology. To the extent that we think it can solve all our problems, and in particular, any problem that technology creates, we can just use technology to fix. I've literally heard senior people like Google say things like, well, we need AI because it will fix the climate crisis. And you're like, but hey, many, many senior people in AI think it could kill all of humanity. And this is the famous, Sorcerer's Apprentice story. The Sorcerer's Apprentice starts out using magic, it goes wrong, and then they use more magic to try and fix the magic they did, and before you know it, the house is going to be destroyed. So I think that at some level there's that. So just to say that, once you've got symptoms, to come to the meta crisis, this is the big one. So there are a bunch of people who are now saying, yeah, there's something wrong. But then it's like, well, maybe it's the immigrants. Maybe it's Trump. Maybe it's populism. If only we didn't have Trump. And when you say to people, but like, hey, like there are obviously maybe, racist people who voted for Trump or whatever it is, but quite a lot of people, nearly 50% of Americans, or maybe more than 50% of voting Americans, at least people who went and voted for them. They're not all like that. Maybe some of them are really impacted by inequality, and this person aren't providing a maybe untrue, but solution. It's like, and then you have to ask what that is. And just for example, to give an example here, when you look at the American, the election of Trump, for me, this is a very simple meritocratic narrative. We have modernity dying, post-modernity kind of being born. And at that point, when you have two paradigms in conflict, you get a lot of pain. You get a culture war. The last time it happened in Western Europe was between Protestantism and Catholicism. Protestantism was modernity, Catholicism was pre-modernity. And you had decades, if not centuries, of brutal civil war, right? I think the simplest example of what's going on is not Facebook. The reason we have polarization, all these other things right now, is we're in a culture war between two major paradigms, one being born and one dying. And, the alliance that elects Trump is actually modernity plus pre-modernity put together in America. Like Elon Musk is not pre-modernist. Elon Musk is not an evangelical fundamentalist Christian. He's a modernist. Now, the point I'm just saying all of this is in the whole discussion of the US election, I've almost never seen this viewpoint set out. I've never seen a New York Times article talking about cultural paradigms and cultural evolution or any of these things.
Yeah.
So when you're asking about the diagnosis at the moment today, that step, and even in my experience of people coming to our hubs, people who come for residencies, I would say the percentage of them who've even read Wilbur is well under 50%. The number of people who are lost and searching is now much higher. Who are in stage one, I see the symptoms, I see something is wrong. The number of them who have a solid, and I'm not saying even like what a right one is, but even for themselves, a solid, like it fits together, story about why it's happening. And the number of them, I would say, I'm of the view that like the integral metamodern story is kind of, second racial story is kind of got some real validity to it, is even fewer. And so I think, and I think to kind of go back to something Sylvie is really emphasizing, in my experience of conveying that story, a percentage of that is intellectual. I wish it was more. I'm a left brain kind of guy sometimes, but a large portion of it goes back to shadows or fears. Like when you actually really look at the symptoms, it's very scary to think of like what's happening to our society. That requires a whole bunch of just kind of holding, and then to really look. I can be a capitalist now and be like, okay, I'm going to fund EA. I'll fund EA groups that work on AI alignment. But I'm not going to fund groups that call into question why I earn all my money. Anthropic founders are going to give maybe billions of dollars to effective altruism organizations, some of which will work on dealing with the risk of AI, but they won't be giving money to organizations that want to stop AI progress, probably. They're not going to be giving money to organizations that call into question the way that digital capitalism works. So, that going that deeper level is psychologically very confronting because it calls into question where you came from in a way, right? And particularly where if you're in the elite, which I'm also a part of in a way, the elite, I'm educated, I'm white, but they're always disaffected elite, of which I'm probably one. But, Trump is actually another one, probably a disaffected elite, even though he's made it. But my point is to say that that's a hard thing. So just for example, you look at philanthropic money, where it's going, there's almost no funding for this space. I mean, just none. And if you look at the billions of dollars that have gone into EA, for example, in recent times, because ultimately at some level, effective altruism is quite aligned with the techno-capitalist paradigm.
Yeah. I recently heard something that like the big issue is like where we're spending our money, where we're actually investing our money, like we're investing it in the wrong things. But yeah, that frame is also, I think the frame you shared is a useful frame. I know you guys have something after this. Maybe one more question I can do, or is it going to cut it too close?
Maybe Sylvie will answer it, so it's very short, and I will say nothing. That's the rule, I think, here. So ask that one question, then we check out. Let's do that.
Cool. Well, this is kind of directed to you, Sylvie, and you already touched on art a little bit, but I think maybe there's a little bit more. And obviously, we can't speak about Second Renaissance without speaking about art. And there is this idea that novelists and artists are ahead of culture, that they're sensing and dramatizing truths that philosophers and scientists haven't yet formalized. I once heard Jordan Peterson speak about how Dostoevsky was essentially mapping the psychological and spiritual crisis of modernity before thinkers like Nietzsche fully articulated them. So despite on focusing on what's emergent in culture, it seems to me that the broader liminal web is quite intellectually heavy and that art tends to take a backseat. And as an artist myself, as a recording artist, I've actually been noticing a similar pattern in my own life. I remember I had a conversation with Emil Friss, who's like one half of Hansi Freinheit, and art came up and he was essentially saying, forget the theory, just go all in on the art, which is ironic given that he's a theorist. But I'm wondering if you see kind of a similar trend in the liminal web. And if so, how do you think we might start giving art more primacy? I think you're working on some of that stuff. So
yes, well, absolutely. That had been actually a part of my dilemma and at time frustration with the space. I'm like, okay, we're all talking, but let's just make art.
Yeah.
And that's why I've initiated the Second Renaissance magazine, the Second Renaissance Art Manifesto, the little art collective, wanting to running a small art residency, because I think there's already metamodern artists who don't know about metamodernity. There's lots of artists, I think, who are experimenting and embodying and have these antennas. And for me, a part of the magazine was also showcasing some artists who have no idea about the space, but I can feel that they have those components and it's the touching. I think also I want to actually write a white paper that shows the ancestors, the artistic ancestors that maybe even established artists that hold these components. Handsome Kiefer, Bill Viola, Marina Abramovich. I'm like, actually, you have maybe not all the components, but definitely certain components of metamodernism or Second Renaissance, and tracing that and making that movement more visible to others, to artists themselves. Because I think sometimes when you're artist, you can feel very isolated and not, linking the dots. And yeah, absolutely. I think I would agree. Like, forget too much. Like, at some point, you got to put the theory aside and just, as I'll say, open the barrage, the flood the world with art, and that's a crucial element of how the art and the movement happens. So if there's any artists there, I love, collaborating with others. And it's also how we make art. Do we stop making art as individual, but more as collective? What is this new form of art that is really not even what art how we've used to make art? I'm really quite excited about that, about an art form that is not considered as an art form yet, that is emerging, that, take those components of maybe emerging dialogue mixed with maybe music and, perform, let's, and I think artists always have a part of them that are radical, willing to be experimental, go quite full in, and go more in the right brain. And have this alliance of right brain, left brain of, yes, there's wonderful metamodern Second Renaissance theory, and let's weave that.
Yeah, I think the other thing you were saying is that, people change when their hearts are touched, and there's something about art that it's easier to touch somebody's heart with that. So,
yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate both of you coming and exploring your work, and really love what you're doing with Life Itself. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to kind of following your journey and perhaps collaborating more and doing things together. And yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artem, and likewise.
Yeah, all the best.